Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Sketch Adventure. In today's episode, we're going to be focusing on hands. I'm going to start today's episode with a fairly loose sketch in gouache. My goal is to try to focus on the large planes and simple color statements. Because I'm less confident with painting hands, I start with a pencil sketch to establish some sense of basic proportions and construction. Once I'm satisfied with that, I move on to the first step of painting, establishing the darks. Now because this hand is going to be more of a middle value and color range, I'm going to block in the shadows lighter and more saturated than in my previous sketches. When painting outdoors or in environments that generally have more ambient light, the contrast between shadows and lights will be reduced. There you can see I've laid a test mark, but quickly realized there isn't enough water in the mixture for the paint to cover very much of the paper. It takes a lot of trial and error to get a feeling of how much water a mixture needs. I usually dip a tiny part of the corner of my brush and then mix it around on my palette until it feels like it will flow well. I almost always try to avoid having a watery mixture that'll pool on my page. Even though the shadows look extremely high in saturation, I won't be able to judge accurately until the whole hand has been blocked in. If it still doesn't look right after I've laid in the rest of the colors, I can always change it. It's usually easier for me to desaturate later rather than realizing I didn't go saturated enough from the beginning. Looking back on it, using the white there was a bit much. It was intended to remind myself of where the side and top planes meet on the fingers. It's another thing that can be adjusted later, although I don't think I actually do. I draw contour lines around some of the fingers. It's another thing I like to do when I want to make a definite edge. If I don't like the look later, I can always lighten it or darken the reflected portions of the shadows. I'm darkening the portions of the fingers that are bent and turned away from the overhead light source. If we're to imagine that light travels in straight lines, then a plane that's tangent to that light source won't be getting hit by it, at least not directly. I'm not really sure why I chose to darken the top plane of that index finger. It takes away from the clarity. I'm pretty sure I come back and fix it later. I just find it strange that it was something I thought to do in the moment. You can see that I've started to break my own rule. I've made areas of the lights as dark as areas of the shadows, and it looks like there's now bruising or blood on his hand rather than changes in the form. Fortunately, there's still hope. I can either lighten all the marks that are too dark, keeping the light and dark families distinct, or I can play the dangerous game of darkening all the lighter areas, making the difference between light and shadow very slight. I always find it interesting how when I'm painting it seems like I'm in control of what I'm doing, only to see on these video playbacks that they could have been so much simpler and clearer. That's one of the reasons why I think sketching is so important. I do think it's important to make tight finished works as well, but sketching is just as important in order to learn how to simplify or summarize. Break time. Take a look at this hand, or this one. When I look at any of these funny looking hands, the first thing I think about is what's in shadow and what's in light. I also like to imagine simple geometric structures that are present. If you look at something while keeping this in mind, you can project wireframes onto anything you look at. Just remember to keep it simple and natural, if you want. Okay, let's paint again. Now that I'm warmed up, I'm going to sketch this hand directly with paint. I actually find it makes a surprisingly big difference in my mentality. If I start with a pencil sketch, especially true if it's tight, I'll be overly careful and precious with my paint application. If I sketch it with paint, I usually find the drawing as I go and freely make adjustments. Because painting for me is largely unpredictable, I much prefer to make adjustments as I go and stay loose with it. In addition to finding the dark shapes on the hand itself, I decided to drop in a background, so it's going to fall into the dark group. While I work in the lights, I'm laying down some general color notes, little dabs of color that indicate what will be there as the painting develops. Sometimes I do this when thinking about value, but right now I just want to get some color variations in the hues so that there's a diversity of hues in the hands. As I lay down different colors and values, I want to make sure to keep them confined to a fairly narrow range, and then later, once all the colors are down, I can start to darken some areas closer to the shadows. Sometimes I work from the shadows outwards, and other times I lay down a general value across the lights and then come back and add variations later. I suggest experimenting and find what process works best for you. At this point, I think it's a good time to lay down the final background color. I had wanted the skin tones to greatly contrast the background, so I knew I was going to be adding something really dark. One thing I only noticed after I filmed this was how when I was painting the background, I painted over my line indicating the width of the wrist and made it way too narrow, so it ends up looking a bit cartoony in the end. Like I had said before, I find painting to be largely unpredictable. I can choose to paint with tiny brushes, controlling the process the whole time, but I find that without the happy accidents, there's a certain dynamic quality that just isn't present in the painting. Even though I've done and continue to do meticulous work with graphite pencils, when it comes to paint, I like letting go and hoping that my drawing technique will be my safety net. The last remaining parts to be blocked in are the planes of the fingers, which are facing away. I've left them to last because they've got a warm fill light illuminating them. Once I drop in those yellow-orange tones, I'll be able to start making my second pass and adjusting my shapes and colors again. This is my general process. Once each piece of the puzzle has been placed, I can just look around for what needs adjusting and do as many passes as needed on the whole painting. Don't worry if painting is a struggle. The most important thing is to pick something that you want to focus on in a painting session. It could be really clear structural shapes, or maybe color harmony, or maybe really clear value groups. Whatever the focus is, make sure that you try to accomplish that one goal, because when you do sketches like this, you're more than likely going to fail in multiple areas. So pick one and try to nail it. By always looking at what we need to improve on, we'll guarantee that there'll always be constant improvement, even though at times it feels like we're constantly failing. Anytime I lay down a stroke that's too dark in value, I don't have to worry about being stuck with it, because with oils I can blend it into its surrounding colors. This is something I intentionally do, but I have to remind myself that it's not an option when I'm using gouache. From here on out, I continue to refine and subdivide the shapes further, making sure I don't have any large shapes that remain one solid color. The reason for this is the further I go along in any painting, I want to break down the large shapes into a series of smaller facets, but I make sure not to lose the big shapes in the process. The big shapes are like a house for the small shapes to live inside. As I'm getting close to the end of the painting, I want to mention that as of this video, I've launched a Patreon focused around mentoring. I'm offering different types of mentorships at different tiers, ranging from video paintovers with commentary to one-on-one live sessions. My focus with the mentorships is to teach the fundamentals of painting and composition, while working with each student individually to add their interests into the schedule as well. So if that's something that interests you, feel free to check it out and send me a message if you have any questions. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll see you on the next sketch adventure.